For instance, American Airlines chief executive Doug Parker had a quote stating fares are too low for oil prices this high on their recent earnings call. So, even the CEOs of the companies are really finding it difficult to make ends meet and actually incur a profit. The rising operating costs resulted in American Airlines being down $757 million. So in that case, they're really trying to stay up, but due to all these higher costs and things, they're not finding it very easy. So even the CEO is publicly stating that it's just too high of these oil prices for them to operate positively. And then another thing to note is in comparison to the cost of flights, the profit per passenger is extremely low. So at that point, these airlines aren't even making a profit for all that they're doing. So as you can see on the next slide, who's growing, who's shrinking? A lot of airline carriers have shifted adding into low-cost carriers within their portfolio. 2 ultra low-cost carriers have made large shifts. So for example, Primera Air has closed, and WOW Air is no longer offering a lot of flights within the United States. When I studied abroad, I took Ryanair, which is a low-cost carrier. The unique part about it was the cost to fly to another country was potentially about €30. However, there was an additional cost to have a carry-on bag. So that was something to keep in mind, and that's how the airlines made that additional amount to offset some of those operating costs that they're facing. The next couple of slides are TALIA, so barriers to entry, competitive advantages, and then once we move into the business analysis, I'll be talking about cost of production. So the cost of production continues to increase for airlines year to year. As I just mentioned, being that the fuel prices are increasing, the cost to operate and fly planes increases as well. The New York Times confirmed that the cost of fuel has gone up 50% in the last year. So following suit with what the CEO of American Airlines was saying, that it's super hard to keep up with how these fuel prices are increasing. So an uptick of 50% is a significant amount and definitely affects the financials from a year-to-year perspective. And these financials need to be taken into account as they're doing their reconciliation of what the expenses for the year were, and helps them plan what they need to do going into the next year in terms of pricing and making sure that it's worth their while to have flights fly as frequently as they are. So the surcharges of fuel that was added causes extra fees to the tickets in the past. But once the cost of fuel had gone down most recently, probably in the last 5 years, airlines decided to use the extra money to reinvest their business. Some trends that we're seeing within the airline industry is a lot of the commercial airlines created these low-cost carriers, as I mentioned earlier. In addition, they're actually adding even ultra low-cost carriers. So for example, what I mentioned on a personal level was Ryanair in Europe. They're not the only one who does this. It's not unique to them. A lot of different airlines started doing this because they know people who are traveling out of the country like having these options. Some commercial airlines even began to offer consumer-specific luxuries that would be found on full-service carriers. So a lot of the times, these amenities are important to people. So they decided to figure out a way to include this within their business model in order to accommodate their consumers. And as I mentioned, the increase in fuels have a direct correlation with pricing, and that'll continue to shape how these tickets are priced out because, as I mentioned, the price that the cost per passenger is definitely not offsetting what the profit that the airlines are making, and therefore it is not, it's not evening out and causing these airlines to not make as much money as they would have previously. The next slide talks about volume, pricing, and appropriate metrics. So airline industries continue to have a large increase in available flights for consumers. One of the major complaints that is happening, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, is that the seats have gotten narrower and consumers have lost their legroom. So I know most recently my flight had 3 people in a row, and it was very crowded. So this is something that I've seen shift over the years. I've always traveled with my family for work, my mom's work rather, and I've experienced that they, keep getting smaller and smaller, and they're packing in more airline passengers at a time. And the volume of seats have increased, which has a direct correlation between the amounts of profit an airline can make per flight. So, since they're making such a low amount per passenger, they're really packing in, hoping to exceed that. In addition, the pricing of seats varies depending on the number of seats and how much money the flight needs to make in order to at least make the cost of production. So this is just really full circle. The pricing really does affect how much these airlines are making, if anything at all. And then on the next slide, it talks about capital spending needs. So airlines need to make sure their planes are meeting government regulations required in order to fly. As I mentioned, in most recent years, there's been a lot of deregulation, which has created opportunities for these airlines. However, since it's civilian safety, there are still a lot of regulations in place, and this does create challenges for the airlines. In terms of capital expenditures, this can be classified as the funds used by a company to help upgrade and maintain their physical assets. And as we know, people who are flying want the best accommodations. They want new TVs, new seats. They don't want to be in a seat that's falling apart. So this is all costly for the airlines to make sure they're upkeeping their amenities for their consumers. And this is something that also relates to safety, so they have to be making sure that the regulations are in place and that they're, creating safe travel accommodations as well. The next couple of slides are Talia's, and she will be talking about them for you. In terms of company news, one thing that I found a lot of articles, which I'm sure, as I mentioned, is customer satisfaction. This continues to be a big thing shaping the airline industry. Within many large industries, there's a lot of issues with customer satisfaction, but particular airlines, and I've seen this, whether it's on the news or in the newspaper, many employees complained about various aspects of their position. So, for example, their failed scheduling systems, punitive sick policy and contract, and then seniority violations. So there's been a lot of uptick of, not satisfied employees, which definitely shapes the customer experience as well, and it trickles down all the way to the day-to-day of the airlines and how they operate. So due to this dissatisfaction, many American airline employees in November 2018 picketed outside their airports. So this picket was not the only one that took place in this year, but in addition, they're not the only airline who experienced these types of employee strikes. And then next up is customer service news for American Airlines. So since there has been so many customer service complaints, American Airlines took an initiative to bring in a service analyst. It was a newly created position, so it's not a part of the crew. However, they're there to make sure that the airline is offering a consistent level of service across all their flights. So obviously no team is going to be the same per flight, and they can use the guidelines to the best of their ability. However, there was a complaint that the service wasn't the same. So this position was created by American Airlines to ensure that's going to be the case going forward. There was complaints from the flight crew about this position, almost on a territorial perspective. However, American Airlines sees it as a benefit. And then it'll be interesting to see if other airlines implement this position as well, being that it's not a typical position. However, they're instilling it in order to create that customer satisfaction. So I will be curious to see going forward if other airlines do implement it, since there is such an unsatisfied population within the of the airline industry. And then next up, my group members will be discussing their portion. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a good rest of your week.